Let me take you back to Venezuela in the early 2020s, the years just before Nicolas Maduro's potential downfall. Not the Venezuela of tourist brochures or government propaganda, but the real Venezuela. The Venezuela that ordinary people lived in every single day, while their president enjoyed luxuries they could not even imagine. This is a story of two worlds existing in the same country at the same time. One world of unimaginable privilege, another world of desperate survival, both presided over by a man who claimed to represent the people while living like a king. To understand how Venezuela reached this point, we need to go back briefly to where it all began. Venezuela was once the wealthiest nation in South America. The country sits on the largest proven oil reserves in the world, larger even than Saudi Arabia. In the 1970s, Venezuela had a higher per capita income than Spain, Greece, or Israel. The currency, the bolivar, was strong. The middle class was thriving. Caracas, the capital city, was cosmopolitan and modern. Then came Hugo Chavez. Chavez took power in 1999, promising a Bolivarian revolution, a socialist transformation that would redistribute Venezuela's oil wealth to the poor. And at first, with oil prices soaring, it seemed to work. Poverty rates dropped. Social programs expanded. Chavez became a hero to millions of Venezuelans who had been left behind by previous governments. But the programs were unsustainable. Instead of investing oil revenues wisely, building institutions, diversifying the economy, Chavez spent everything on social programs and political patronage. He nationalized thousands of private companies, driving away investment and expertise. He printed money to cover budget deficits, sowing the seeds of hyperinflation. He concentrated power, weakening democratic institutions. He appointed loyalists rather than competent administrators. When Chavez died of cancer in 2013, he left behind an economy built on sand. And the man who inherited this crumbling edifice was Nicolas Maduro. Maduro was a former bus driver and union organizer who had been completely loyal to Chavez, but he lacked Chavez's charisma, his political skill, his connection with ordinary Venezuelans. And unlike Chavez, Maduro did not have the cushion of high oil prices. When he took power, oil prices were beginning their collapse. The Venezuelan economy began collapsing with them. What followed was one of the worst economic disasters in modern history, not caused by war or natural disaster, but by catastrophically bad governance. Let me tell you what life was like for an ordinary Venezuelan citizen under Maduro's rule. Imagine waking up in Caracas, Venezuela's capital city, in the year 2022. You are a school teacher, a profession that was once middle class and respected. Your salary is officially 130 bolivars per month. That sounds like a number until you understand what it means in real terms. Due to hyperinflation that peaked at over 1,700,000% in 2018, one of the highest inflation rates ever recorded in human history, your salary of 130 bolivars is worth approximately $5 per month. $5 per month. You cannot survive on $5 per month. Nobody can. So you do what millions of other Venezuelans do. You work multiple jobs. You sell things on the street. You depend on remittances from family members who fled the country. You skip meals. You make impossible choices between food and medicine, between electricity and water. Let me walk you through a typical day. You wake up at 5 in the morning, not because you want to, but because the electricity might go out at any moment. Rolling blackouts are constant. Sometimes power disappears for hours, sometimes for days. You need to prepare breakfast while you still have electricity. But there's another problem. There is no running water. Venezuela's infrastructure has collapsed so completely that even in the capital city, running water is sporadic at best. You have been storing water in buckets and containers, but your supply is running low. You will need to wait in line at a community water tank later today, standing for hours in the sun for the chance to fill a few containers. For breakfast, you have coffee if you're lucky enough to have found some, and perhaps a small piece of bread. Bread, if available, costs a significant portion of your daily budget. A single kilogram of meat costs more than your monthly salary. You leave for school at 6 in the morning. Public transportation is unreliable and dangerous. The metro system breaks down constantly. Buses are scarce because there is no fuel or spare parts. Even though Venezuela has the world's largest oil reserves, there are fuel shortages everywhere because the national oil company, PDVSA, has been so thoroughly mismanaged and looted that production has collapsed by 75%. You walk to school, a journey that takes 90 minutes. You pass through neighborhoods where crime is rampant. Venezuela has one of the highest murder rates in the world. Armed gangs called colectivos, often with government connections, control many neighborhoods. The police are underpaid, under-equipped, and often corrupt. You keep your head down and walk quickly. You arrive at school at 8. The building is falling apart. There has been no maintenance in years. Classrooms lack basic supplies. There are no textbooks because the government cannot afford to print them. Many of your colleagues have not shown up. They have left the country, joining the more than 7 million Venezuelans who have fled since Maduro took power, one of the largest refugee crises in the world. The students who do attend are often hungry. Malnutrition rates among Venezuelan children have skyrocketed. You can see it in their faces, their listless energy, their difficulty concentrating. Some children have fainted in class from hunger. You teach as best you can, but it is difficult when you are hungry yourself, when there are no materials, when the electricity cuts out in the middle of a lesson, when everyone in the room knows that education feels meaningless in a country with no future. At noon, the school provides a meal for students. It is part of a government program, but the portions are tiny and the quality is poor. Many children depend on this single meal as their primary food for the day. After school ends at 2, you do not go home. You cannot afford to. You go to your second job, selling items in an informal street market. Perhaps you are selling vegetables you managed to buy cheap. Perhaps you are reselling items that relatives abroad sent you. The informal economy is how most Venezuelans survive. You work until evening. The streets are dangerous after dark, so you hurry home before sunset. Along the way, you join a line at a pharmacy, hoping to find basic medicines. Your mother needs insulin. She is diabetic, but insulin is nearly impossible to find. The pharmacy has been empty for weeks. This is not unusual. Venezuela's healthcare system has collapsed. Hospitals lack basic supplies like antibiotics, painkillers, surgical gloves. Doctors have fled the country. Medical equipment does not work because there are no spare parts or maintenance. People die from treatable conditions because medicine is unavailable or unaffordable. You cannot find insulin today. You try to suppress your panic about what this means for your mother. You arrive home exhausted. There is no electricity. You eat a small dinner of rice and beans if you have them. Rice and beans were once a staple of the Venezuelan diet. Now they are luxury items for many families. You go to bed early to conserve energy, and because there's nothing else to do in the dark. You lie awake worrying about money, about your mother's health, about whether you should join the exodus and leave Venezuela like so many others, about whether there is any future here at all. This is a normal day for millions of Venezuelans, day after day after day, year after year. But let me give you more specific details, because the devil is in the details, and these details matter. When you go to a grocery store in Maduro's Venezuela, if you can even find one that is open and stocked, you might see prices that change by the hour. Hyperinflation was so severe that store owners literally repriced items multiple times per day. A loaf of bread might cost one price in the morning and double by afternoon. Money lost value so quickly that people rushed to spend it immediately because waiting even a day meant it would buy less. The bolivar became worthless. People stopped counting bills and started weighing them. A stack of bills required to buy basic items was so large that people carried money in bags. Eventually, Venezuela simply gave up on its currency and dollarized unofficially. Those who had access to dollars, usually through remittances from relatives abroad, could survive. Those who did not have dollars faced starvation. The collapse was visible everywhere. In Caracas, once a gleaming modern capital, buildings fell into disrepair. Potholes swallowed entire streets. Traffic lights stopped working. Parks became overgrown. The famous Caracas metro system, once a source of national pride, broke down so completely that trains sat rusting on the tracks. Escalators froze. Stations flooded. Commuters descended into stations that looked post-apocalyptic. Shopping malls, which once bustled with middle-class consumers, became ghost towns. Store after store closed. The few that remained open had empty shelves. Security guards outnumbered customers. Supermarkets implemented rationing systems. You could only shop on certain days based on your identification number. You could only buy limited quantities of items. And even with these restrictions, shelves were bare. People would hear rumors that a shipment of flour or rice had arrived somewhere, and hundreds would rush to form lines that lasted for hours, sometimes overnight, with no guarantee that supplies would last until they reached the front. These lines became a defining image of Maduro's Venezuela. Lines for food, lines for medicine, lines for gasoline despite having the world's largest oil reserves, lines for water, lines for everything. People spent more time standing in lines than working or sleeping. The psychological toll was immense. Imagine the stress of never knowing if you will eat tomorrow. Imagine watching your children go hungry. Imagine seeing elderly parents suffer because you cannot find their medicine. Imagine the shame of being unable to provide for your family despite working multiple jobs. And yet, people persisted. Venezuelans developed survival strategies. They formed community networks. They created informal barter systems. They helped each other in ways that government never did. But resilience has its limits. By the early 2020s, Venezuela had experienced the largest peacetime economic contraction in modern history. The economy had shrunk by more than 75%. To put that in perspective, the American Great Depression saw the economy shrink by about 27%. Venezuela's collapse was 3 times worse. Life expectancy declined. Infant mortality increased. Diseases that had been eradicated returned because vaccination programs collapsed. Violence became endemic. Venezuela's murder rate was among the highest in the world outside of active war zones. This was the daily reality for ordinary Venezuelans under Maduro. a grinding, desperate struggle for basic survival in a country that should have been wealthy. This is a normal day for millions of Venezuelans, day after day, year after year. This is the Venezuela that ordinary citizens experienced under Nicolas Maduro. Now let me tell you about the other Venezuela, the Venezuela that Nicolas Maduro and his inner circle experienced. While teachers earned $5 a month, while ordinary Venezuelans starved, Maduro lived like royalty. Maduro's official residence is La Casona, a luxurious estate in Caracas, but he also has access to multiple properties, including lavish homes and estates throughout Venezuela. He travels in armored luxury vehicles. He's protected by hundreds of security personnel, including Cuban intelligence officers who serve as his personal bodyguards. When Maduro travels internationally, he stays in the finest hotels. When his wife, Celia Flores, travels abroad, she is photographed carrying handbags worth thousands of dollars. Their sons, known as the narco-nephews, were convicted in United States courts of drug trafficking conspiracy, revealing the corruption at the heart of the regime. Let me give you specific examples that were documented and reported. In 2018, while Venezuelans were literally starving, while hospitals had no medicine, while children were malnourished, Maduro was filmed at an exclusive restaurant in Istanbul, Turkey, eating a gourmet meal prepared by celebrity chef Salt Bay. The video showed Maduro and his wife enjoying expensive steaks, smoking cigars, and clearly relishing the luxury while their country suffered. The video went viral, sparking outrage around the world. The meal Maduro enjoyed that night cost more than most Venezuelan teachers earn in a year. But that was just one documented instance. There were many others. Maduro's stepson, Walter Gavidia, was photographed wearing a $20,000 Rolex watch. Government officials' children posted pictures on social media from luxury vacations in Aruba, Paris, Dubai. They showed off designer clothes, expensive cars, nightclub champagne bottles that cost more than a Venezuelan family's annual income. While ordinary Venezuelans stood in lines for hours, hoping to buy a bag of flour, regime officials had access to luxury imported goods. While Venezuelan farmers could not get seeds or fertilizer, officials had private supplies of everything they needed. The corruption was not hidden, it was flaunted. Officials seemed to take pleasure in displaying their wealth while the country suffered. It was not just that they were stealing, it was that they were rubbing it in people's faces. Food distribution became a tool of political control. The clap boxes, which were supposed to contain subsidized food staples, were often distributed based on political loyalty. If you supported the regime, you might receive a box. If you were known to support the opposition, you might be denied. Government workers were required to attend pro-Maduro rallies or risk losing their jobs. Students were pressured to join socialist youth groups. This was not just economic collapse. It was a system designed to maintain power through the strategic distribution of scarcity. When people are desperate for food, they become easy to control. The regime also controlled access to passports and identity documents. If you wanted to leave the country, you needed a passport. But getting a passport could take years and required bribes that most people could not afford. The government essentially held the population hostage, making escape difficult even for those desperate to leave. Meanwhile, Maduro gave speeches blaming American imperialism for Venezuela's problems. He claimed sanctions were causing the suffering. He presented himself as a victim, as a defender of sovereignty against foreign aggression. His supporters, known as Chavistas, repeated these talking points. But the timeline did not support the narrative. Venezuela's collapse began long before significant American sanctions were imposed. When Maduro traveled to the United Nations or other international forums, he arrived in luxury. His delegation stayed in expensive hotels. They ate at fine restaurants. They presented an image of a functioning government while their country was in free fall. The hypocrisy was staggering. A government that claimed to be socialist, that claimed to represent the working class, that claimed to fight for equality, was presiding over one of the most unequal societies on earth. The gap between the ruling elite and ordinary citizens was not just economic, it was a chasm. While ordinary Venezuelans could not access basic health care, Maduro and his officials received medical treatment in Cuba or traveled abroad to exclusive private clinics. While Venezuelan children were malnourished, government officials were well fed. While power outages plunged cities into darkness, government buildings and wealthy neighborhoods had backup generators and consistent electricity. The scale of corruption in Maduro's Venezuela is staggering. Billions of dollars in oil revenue simply disappeared. Government contracts were awarded to shell companies owned by regime insiders. Food import licenses became tools of political patronage and personal enrichment. The local supply and production committees, known by their Spanish acronym CLAP, which were supposed to distribute subsidized food to the poor, became instruments of political control and corruption. High-ranking officials bought mansions in Miami, Madrid, and Panama with money stolen from the Venezuelan people. Their children attended expensive private schools abroad. They maintained lifestyles of extraordinary luxury while presiding over economic collapse. Diosdado Cabello, One of Maduro's closest allies, and one of the most powerful men in Venezuela, has been accused by the United States Treasury Department of leading a drug trafficking organization. Tarek El Aissami, who served as Maduro's vice president, was sanctioned by the United States for drug trafficking. These were not low-level officials. These were men at the very top of the government. The military, which kept Maduro in power, was also deeply involved in corruption. High-ranking generals controlled vast smuggling operations, trafficking everything from gasoline to gold to cocaine. They grew wealthy while ordinary soldiers went unpaid and unfed. This is what kleptocracy looks like, a government that exists not to serve the people but to enrich those in power. The contrast between Maduro's Venezuela and the people's Venezuela was not just economic, it was moral. It represented a fundamental betrayal. Maduro came to power claiming to continue Chavez's socialist revolution, claiming to represent the poor, claiming to fight against imperialism and inequality. But his actions revealed the lie. He was not fighting for the poor, he was living off them. Let me tell you about the political situation because it was just as devastating as the economic situation. Venezuela under Maduro was a dictatorship disguised as a democracy. Elections were held, but they were neither free nor fair. Opposition candidates were banned from running. Opposition leaders were arrested on false charges. The electoral system was manipulated. International observers documented widespread fraud. In 2015, the opposition coalition won a supermajority in the National Assembly, the Venezuelan legislature. It was a stunning repudiation of Maduro. The people had voted for change, but Maduro refused to accept the result. He simply created a new legislature called the Constituent Assembly, staffed entirely with his supporters, and transferred all power to it. The elected National Assembly was rendered powerless. When Juan Guaido, the president of the National Assembly, declared himself interim president in 2019, citing constitutional provisions that the presidency was vacant due to the fraudulent 2018 election, millions of Venezuelans took to the streets in support. More than 50 countries, including the United States, recognized Guaido as Venezuela's legitimate leader. Maduro's response was brutal repression. Security forces fired on protesters. Thousands were arrested. Many were tortured. The United Nations documented systematic human rights violations, including extrajudicial killings by security forces. Freedom of speech disappeared. Journalists were arrested. News outlets were shut down. Social media was monitored. People were afraid to speak openly against the government because it could cost them their jobs, their freedom, or their lives. This was the political reality. A government that maintained power through fear, fraud, and force. Meanwhile, Maduro blamed everyone but himself for Venezuela's catastrophe. He blamed American sanctions. He blamed the opposition. He blamed sabotage. He blamed economic warfare. Everyone was responsible except the government that actually ran the country. Now, sanctions did have an impact, particularly sanctions targeting Venezuela's oil industry imposed in 2019. But Venezuela's economic collapse began years before those sanctions. The country was already in free fall due to corruption, mismanagement, and disastrous economic policies. Maduro also maintained power through international support. Cuba provided intelligence and security assistance, essentially helping Maduro maintain a police state. Russia and China provided financial support and diplomatic cover, protecting Venezuela from international pressure. But the most important factor keeping Maduro in power was the military. As long as the generals remained loyal, Maduro was safe. And the generals remained loyal because they were profiting from the corruption. They had a vested interest in maintaining the system. This brings us to the question that hung over Venezuela for years. How would this end? How would Maduro leave power? Many people thought he would be voted out, but elections were rigged. Some thought the military would turn against him, but the generals were too invested in the system. Some thought international pressure would force him out, but he had powerful allies. Some thought popular uprising would overthrow him, but the security forces were too strong and the population too exhausted and desperate. And then, in 2025, something changed. The United States announced a bounty for Maduro's capture, $15 million, the largest bounty ever offered by the United States government for a foreign leader. The charges were drug trafficking conspiracy, narcoterrorism, and corruption. The bounty changed the calculus. It put a price on loyalty. It created incentives for betrayal. It raised the possibility that someone close to Maduro, someone with access, might decide that $15 million was worth more than continued loyalty to a failing regime. This is the context in which Maduro's potential capture must be understood, not as a sudden collapse, but as the culmination of years of corruption, mismanagement, repression, and international isolation that made his position increasingly untenable. Before any potential capture, Venezuela was a country in ruins, a country where teachers earned $5 a month while their president ate $1,000 steaks, a country where children starved while officials bought mansions abroad, a country with the world's largest oil reserves where people could not buy gasoline, a country where hospitals had no medicine while the elite received treatment in foreign clinics. Venezuela was a moral catastrophe, an economic disaster, a humanitarian crisis, a cautionary tale about what happens when power becomes concentrated, when institutions are destroyed, when corruption becomes systemic, when leaders serve themselves instead of their people. The Venezuela that existed before Maduro's potential capture was a country that had fallen from wealth to poverty, from democracy to dictatorship, from hope to despair, all within a single generation. 7 million people fled. Those who remained struggled to survive. The middle class disappeared. The currency became worthless. Crime soared, disease spread, infrastructure crumbled. The future disappeared. And through it all, Maduro lived in luxury, blaming everyone else, claiming to represent the people while betraying them every single day. This is what Venezuela looked like before the capture of Maduro. A country destroyed by the very man who claimed to be its savior. A revolution that became a robbery. A government that became a criminal enterprise. The story of Venezuela under Maduro is a story about power without accountability, about corruption without consequence, about how quickly a nation can fall when institutions are destroyed and leaders serve only themselves. It is a story we must remember, because the patterns we see in Venezuela, the warning signs, the slow destruction of democratic norms, the concentration of power, the normalization of corruption, these are not unique to Venezuela. They can happen anywhere when people stop paying attention, when institutions become weak, when power goes unchecked. Venezuela is a warning, a reminder that democracy is fragile, that prosperity can be squandered, that nations can fall, that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance. Before his potential capture, Nicolas Maduro presided over one of the greatest destructions of national wealth and human potential in modern history. He took a country that should have been prosperous and turned it into a failed state. He claimed to represent the poor while enriching himself and his cronies. He destroyed the future of millions of people. The Venezuela that existed under Maduro was a tragedy, a preventable, man-made tragedy. A nation that should have thrived but instead barely survived. That is what Venezuela looked like before the capture of Maduro. That is the legacy he left behind. That is the reality millions of Venezuelans lived every single day. Remember this. Remember them. Remember that real people suffered while their leaders lived in luxury. Remember that this was not inevitable. Remember that choices matter. Remember that leadership matters. Remember that accountability matters. I'm watching the past so we can understand the present. And together, we learn from history so we do not repeat its mistakes. See you in the next era.